When everything falls apart, most people do the same thing. They try to put it all back together as fast as possible. They rush to rebuild. They push through the pain. They plaster a smile on and tell themselves they just need to stay positive. And that is exactly backwards. Carl Jung spent decades studying what happens to people when their lives collapse. What he found was terrifying, but also deeply liberating. Because the real path forward is not what you think. Here is the thing no one tells you when your world falls apart. Jung discovered something that still shakes psychologists today. He found that the very thing most people fight against with everything they have is the one thing that could actually save them. The collapse is not the enemy. But before we get to that, we need to talk about why almost everything you have been told about starting over is wrong. Society has one answer for pain. Push through it. Stay positive. Rebuild what you lost. Get back to normal as fast as you can. You have probably heard this your whole life. Maybe you have even said it to someone else. The message is always the same. The old life you had was good, and your only job now is to get back to it. Or build something even better, even faster. Grieve for a week, then get moving. Feel your feelings, but not for too long. The world rewards people who recover quickly. But Jung watched what this approach actually did to people, and what he saw disturbed him deeply. He observed patient after patient who had lost something enormous. A marriage, a career, a sense of who they were, and almost all of them came to him doing the same thing. They were exhausted from fighting, not fighting their circumstances, but fighting themselves. They were fighting the grief, fighting the confusion, fighting the terrifying feeling that the person they used to be might be gone forever. They were white-knuckling their way through life, trying to hold together a self that had already started to break apart, and it was destroying them. There is something uniquely cruel about this trap, because everyone around these people was encouraging them to keep fighting, keep pushing, keep rebuilding. The people who loved them most were telling them exactly the thing that was making it worse, and so they kept going, pouring more energy into an approach that was failing them, feeling increasingly guilty that they were not, healing faster, wondering what was wrong with them. Nothing was wrong with them. The advice was wrong. Jung realized that these people were not struggling because they were weak. They were struggling because they were doing exactly what they had been taught. They were trying to climb back to the surface. They were trying to outrun the darkness, and the harder they ran, the worse it got. This is the backwards approach Jung identified, and understanding why it fails is the first step to understanding what actually works. Think about what happens when you break a bone and do not let it heal properly. You go back to using it too soon, putting weight on it before it is ready, and it heals crooked. It becomes weaker than it was. It hurts in ways the original injury never did. The same thing happens psychologically. When you rush to rebuild after a life collapse, you are putting weight on a bone that has not finished healing. You are building on top of unprocessed pain. And the structure you create will be crooked in ways you will not fully understand until years later, when something small topples it again. Jung saw this pattern repeat itself so many times that he documented it as a core feature of what he called unresolved complexes. The patients who came to him after 2 or 3 collapses in a row were almost always people who had never genuinely gone through the first one. They had gone around it, and each time they ran from the darkness, it followed them into the next chapter of their life. Consider a man in his early 40s who had built what looked like a perfect life. Good job, stable family, a clear sense of who he was. Then one year, almost everything collapsed at once. His marriage ended. His business failed. The identity he had spent 2 decades building simply vanished. He came to Jung exhausted, trying desperately to get back to who he was before. He was working harder than ever, filling every hour so he would not have to sit still. He was doing everything right by society's standards, and yet he was getting worse, not better. Jung recognized the pattern immediately. This man was not healing. He was running. Jung had a name for what was pulling at this man from the inside. He called it the unconscious. And he believed that when a life collapses, the unconscious is not attacking you. It is calling you. It is trying to show you something that the old version of your life never let you see. The problem is that most people treat the unconscious like a threat. They hear that dark, disorienting voice inside that says, "This is not working," or "Who are you really?" and they panic. They medicate it. They distract it. They drink it down or work it away. They do anything except listen to it. And that resistance, Jung believed, is what turns a painful but necessary transformation into a genuine psychological crisis. When people try to rebuild their old life too quickly, they are essentially trying to rebuild a house on a cracked foundation. They put enormous energy into looking the same on the outside. They smile at the right moments. They say they are fine, but underneath, the old self is still dissolving, and it will keep dissolving no matter how hard they try to hold it together. Because the collapse is not a random disaster, it is a signal. Jung referred to this as the dissolution of the persona, and he was serious about what that meant. He believed that certain life collapses are not just difficult moments. They are genuine endings. The persona you built, that carefully constructed social mask you presented to the world, is not waiting for you to come back and reclaim it. That version of you was assembled from a particular set of beliefs, roles, and defenses. And the collapse happened, at least in part, because that structure could no longer hold. It was built on things that were never fully yours to begin with. Other people's expectations. Empaths aren't broken. They're alchemists in progress. The Alchemist's Path gives you drills, Jung-based boundaries, and 3 exclusive chapter videos to turn overwhelm into clarity. By Surreal Mind, 236-page downloadable ebook, in stock. Begin now at thesurrealmind.com. Rules you absorbed as a child. A version of success that looked good from the outside but felt hollow from the inside. The collapse is not happening to you. In Jung's view, it is happening for you, even if it does not feel that way at all. But here is where it gets hard, because Jung did not believe the answer was to simply accept the pain and wait for it to pass. He believed something much more demanding was required. He believed you had to go down before you could go up. He called this the descent into the unconscious. And for many of his patients, it was the most frightening thing they had ever done. Imagine a woman who had given everything to her family for years. Her whole identity had been built around being a caretaker. When her children left home and her husband asked for a divorce, she did not just lose her marriage, she lost herself. She had no idea who she was outside of the role she had played. She came to Jung deeply depressed, convinced something was wrong with her. She wanted to be fixed. She wanted to feel useful again as quickly as possible. But Jung saw something different. He saw someone who had never been allowed to ask the question, "Who am I really?" The depression was not the problem. The depression was the doorway. Jung believed that when the ego, the version of yourself you show the world, collapses, the unconscious steps forward. All the parts of yourself that you pushed aside, the desires you never pursued, the emotions you never expressed, the person you were before the world told you who to be, they all start to surface. This can feel like madness. It can feel like losing control. And for many people, that fear of losing control is exactly why they rush back to the surface. But Jung's patients who stopped running and turned to face what was rising up inside them discovered something extraordinary. They discovered that the darkness was not trying to destroy them. It was trying to complete them. Jung had a word for what lives in that darkness. He called it the shadow. The shadow is not evil. The shadow contains everything your conscious mind refuses to acknowledge, especially the parts of yourself you were told to hide. Your anger, your ambition, your grief, your wildness, your needs. But it goes deeper than that too. The shadow also holds your primitive instincts, your unrealized potential, even qualities you admire in others but have never claimed for yourself. When everything falls apart, the shadow finally has a chance to be seen. And if you have the courage to look at it, it transforms from a threat into a resource. Jung spent years documenting what this looked like in real people. He noticed that the shadow does not disappear when you ignore it. It gets louder. It shows up as anxiety you cannot explain, as restlessness in a life that should feel fine, as a persistent sense that something is missing even when everything looks good on paper. The shadow is not punishing you for ignoring it. It is just trying to get your attention. And when a life collapse happens, it finally has the silence it needs to be heard. And this is where most people make the critical mistake. They feel the shadow rising, and they interpret it as proof that something is terribly wrong with them, that they are going crazy, that they are broken beyond repair. So they run harder, they get busier, they double down on the positive thinking. They do everything possible to keep that darkness at bay. But what if that darkness is not your enemy? What if it is the most honest part of you, finally getting a word in? This is what Jung called the confrontation with the unconscious. And it is the moment that either makes or breaks the whole journey. This is what Jung meant when he talked about individuation. Not self-improvement in the way we usually think about it. Not becoming a better version of your old self, but becoming, for the first time, fully yourself. The people who went through that descent with Jung's guidance did not come back the same. They came back as something more honest, more whole, more real. But let us not rush past how difficult this process actually is. For many of Jung's patients, the moment of facing the shadow was the darkest point in their entire journey. Picture someone who had spent their whole life being agreeable, helpful, and easy to be around. They had buried every angry, selfish, or difficult feeling they had ever had because they believed those feelings made them a bad person. When their life collapsed, all of that buried material started to surface at once. They felt rage they could not explain, dark thoughts they had never had before, a terrifying sense that they did not recognize themselves anymore. They came to Jung convinced they were broken, that something had gone wrong inside them, and Jung told them the opposite. He told them this was actually the most important moment of their psychological life, because for the first time, they were meeting themselves honestly. Jung believed that the people who had the hardest time in this moment were not the ones who were most broken. They were the ones who had been most disciplined in keeping their authentic self locked away. The bigger the mask, the bigger the shadow. And the bigger the shadow, the more overwhelming it feels when it finally comes out. This is the do or die moment Jung described in his work. Not dramatic or theatrical, but utterly real. This is the point where a person either finds the courage to sit with themselves, all of themselves, or they flinch and run back to a smaller version of their life. The ones who ran never really recovered. They rebuilt something, yes, but it was smaller, safer, and somewhere inside, they knew it. The ones who stayed, who sat in that darkness long enough to hear what it was actually saying, they were the ones who transformed. Jung called the full process individuation. It is the journey from a life built on what others expect of you to a life built on who you actually are. It does not happen quickly. It does not happen comfortably. But the people who went through it emerged with something none of them had before. Jung described this resulting state as true integration, a psychological wholeness that could not be shaken by external events because it was not built on external events. It was built on something true, and here is what made Jung so certain about this. He had lived it himself. His own life went through a profound collapse in his early 40s, following a painful break with his mentor, Sigmund Freud. Jung described that period as a descent into his own unconscious, years of confusion, frightening imagery, and a disorienting loss of the professional identity he had built. He did not rush out of it. He sat with it. He drew it. He wrote it all down in what he would later call his Red Book. He considered it the most formative experience of his intellectual life. Everything meaningful he discovered about the human mind came from going through that darkness rather than around it. The woman who had lost herself in the role of caretaker did not go back to being a caretaker. She became something broader. She discovered that underneath all the years of giving to others, there was a person with her own desires, her own creativity, her own voice. She started writing. She started saying no to things that had always drained her. She started having conversations she had been afraid to have for years. She was not repaired. She was revealed. That word matters. Revealed, as in uncovered, as in it was always there, just buried under years of playing a role that was never fully hers. That is what Jung meant when he talked about the authentic self. Not something you have to build, but something you have to uncover. And you cannot uncover it while you are busy plastering over the cracks. The man who had lost his business and his marriage did not rebuild the same life. He realized that the ambition he had been chasing had never actually belonged to him. It had belonged to his father's expectations. When he finally stopped trying to resurrect those expectations and asked what he genuinely wanted, the answer surprised him. A quieter life, a different kind of work. Relationships built on honesty instead of performance. He did not get his old life back. He got a real one. This is what Jung believed with absolute conviction. The collapse is not a detour from your life. In many cases, it is the beginning of your actual life. And the sooner you stop trying to escape it, the sooner it can do what it came to do. Most of us build the first version of ourselves under enormous pressure. We are trying to fit in. We are trying to survive. We are trying to become what our families, our cultures, and our circumstances reward us for being. And for a while, that works. But it has a shelf life. And when it expires, the collapse comes. Not as punishment, but as invitation. The invitation is to stop trying to be who you were and start finding out who you are. Now, I want to be clear about something. Jung was not saying that loss is not painful. He was not saying that you should romanticize your grief or tell yourself your disaster was secretly a blessing. The pain is real. The loss is real. You are allowed to grieve what you had. You are allowed to be angry that it happened. That is not resistance. That is being human. The thing Jung warned against was the desperate, fearful energy of trying to outrun the grief, the constant motion that never lets you sit still, the rebuilding that is really just hiding, the positive thinking that is really just denial with a better wardrobe. The difference between healthy grieving and psychological running is this. Healthy grieving moves through you. Running moves around the thing, always. And the thing you are running from gets bigger the longer you avoid it. So what do you actually do with all of this? Jung's guidance was not complicated, but it was demanding. He asked his patients to do something that sounds simple, but is actually one of the hardest things a person can do. He asked them to stop and to be honest. Not just honest with a therapist or a trusted friend, honest in the privacy of their own mind, in the quiet moments they had been, filling with noise. Radically, privately, uncomfortably honest about what had actually been true in their old life. What had they been pretending did not bother them. What had they been pushing down for years? What had the collapse actually been telling them long before it happened? Because Jung observed again and again that life collapses rarely come from nowhere. They are usually the result of something that had been wrong for a long time, finally becoming impossible to ignore. The relationship that had stopped working years ago, the career that had never felt right, the identity that had always been slightly too small. The collapse is often the loudest version of a message that had been whispering for years. And when you can sit still long enough to hear that message, when you can look at your shadow with something other than terror, something shifts. The darkness stops feeling like an enemy. It starts feeling like information. That information is the raw material of your new life. Jung believed, and the evidence from his clinical work strongly supports this, that the people who come through a genuine life collapse and build something real on the other side are not special. They are not more resilient by nature, and they did not get lucky. They are simply the people who were willing to go down before they tried to go up. They were willing to lose themselves completely before they tried to find themselves again. That willingness is not weakness. It is, without question, the most courageous thing a person can do. So if you are in the middle of a collapse right now, or if you are just starting to feel the ground shifting under your feet, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not have to rush. You do not have to perform recovery for anyone. You do not have to rebuild the old thing faster than anyone expects. Jung once described a patient as someone who came to him convinced that their collapse was proof they had failed at life. What Jung told them changed everything. He said the collapse was not a grade on your performance. It was an invitation to finally stop performing altogether. That simple shift in perspective, from failure to invitation, was the moment real healing began for that person. And it is available to you right now, wherever you are in this process. You are allowed to go through this, all the way through it, not around it. The person you will find on the other side is not who you were before. They are better, not because suffering is automatically improving, but because the journey through your own darkness, done honestly, strips away everything that was never really you to begin with. And what is left is solid in a way that the old version never was. Jung spent his life trying to understand what makes people whole, not happy in a shallow sense, not successful by someone else's definition, but whole, and everything he found pointed to the same conclusion. Wholeness does not come from protecting yourself from collapse. It comes from being willing to go through it. Beginning again does not mean going back. It means going forward into a version of yourself you have not met yet. And that person, the one waiting for you on the other side of this, is worth everything it takes to get there. The backwards path, the one that goes down before it goes up, is truly the only one that leads somewhere real and lasting. In the alchemist's path, perception training for empaths, you'll turn overwhelm into wisdom with practical drills, Jung-inspired boundaries, and step-by-step perception training. This guide includes 3 exclusive chapter videos to deepen each lesson. Written by Surreal Mind, 236 pages, beautifully designed 8.5 by 11 downloadable ebook, in stock now. Start your training today. Feel deeply while thinking clearly. Get the Alchemist's Path at thesurrealmind.com.